Well, thank you everyone for coming out. And thanks for coming to GPSec. I definitely appreciate your time and attendance here. Obviously, we're here to talk about continuous threat exposure management, and I'm honored to introduce Scott Kuffer, founder of Nucleus.
Thanks, Chris. Actually, I see a lot of repeat faces from last year and the year before, so thanks everybody for coming back. I'm glad that's at least somewhat funny enough to encourage repeat attendance. And we're doing things a little bit different this year. You've got me speaking as per normal, but also I figured if we're talking about CTEM, that actually Chris Peltz here is one of the, what I would consider like leading experts in actually implementing CTEM across a lot of different programs and customers. They even have a maturity model around it and all those types of things. So it felt a little disingenuous for me to come up here and be the only one talking about CTEM and be introduced by the guy that knows more about CTEM than me. So anyway, Chris is going to actually be participating in this talk, and he's going to be giving some of his learned lessons from the field as we go through this. But the real goal for our talk today is to kind of alleviate some of the confusion around what CTEM actually looks like in practice, because with a lot of these models, they're very academic. There's very academic language. They use very kind of vague terms like, oh, you need to do validation or you need to do discovery. But like, what does that actually translate to in practice? And that's really the goal here. And hopefully, by the end of this, you'll feel like CTEM isn't quite as scary when you actually start digging into it, or confusing as it probably is. But we have to do the gratuitous, beauty slide here. So you've got myself, Scott Kuffer, one of the co-founders of Nucleus Security. I'm the host of a vulnerability management podcast called Vulnwise. And then, of course, hopefully you all know Chris. He's kind of a legend in the CTEM space. But Chris, introduce yourself. Introduce yourself.
I would not call myself a legend, thank you. So I'm the director of security strategy for the Northeast. I coordinate the team of practitioners that actually helps organizations build their CTEM program, start to implement it. And kind of with that said, I want to see where everyone's at today. So if you are considering implementing CTEM, raise your hand. Cool. Okay, we got a couple. Has anyone taken an actual stab at starting a CTEM practice at their organization?
Jason, you guys have had to. Just say
We're trying. We're trying.
So really what we're trying to leave you with today is A, to understand CTEM a bit better, because it can be confusing, and B, kind of point out some things you are doing today from a process standpoint, or a platform you may already own, and how you can start to just orient those things. We don't have to completely greenfield our find and fix security. Our first step is just take what we have and just kind of orient it a little bit differently, and then know where we have to go.
Perfect.
So anywhere along the way, if you have a question, you can shout it out. We don't have a flow. You're not going to interrupt our flow.
No, we'll interrupt each other probably more than you guys interrupt us.
Yeah, for sure.
So it'll be great. But anyway, let's get started. Agenda. We're here to talk about CTEM. So let's jump into it. So first things first, I always like to say, well, when you say what is CTEM, I always like to look back at where we came from, and it can be very convoluted and confusing on how we got here. So it started on kind of this little journey here. All the way back in 1999 with host-based scanning. So some of you may or may not remember, there were all these host-based tools, things that we would call agents now, were a lot of fun. And we were like, hey, we're deploying all this stuff to the internet, maybe we should try to secure it. We're starting to see worms and things like that. Then we took the next step and we said, great, agents are a real pain to actually implement. Let's go do network scanning, right? So then we went to Qualys and Tenable and said, awesome, we can do authorized scans, we can scan, it's gonna be great, it's gonna be awesome. Then we were like, oh wow, we have a lot of stuff. Like, we don't know what to do with all this stuff. Now that we have proliferation of scanning, we actually have too much stuff and more than we can fix. So RVVM and VPT were both things that came out around how do you actually prioritize all this stuff and what are we gonna fix, right? Because we're like, hey, we have a million things, what are the 10 that we're going to fix? And then we realized there's actually a further step beyond that, which was, turns out we actually still need agents because the cloud transitions are happening. So we went in a full circle where we went from host-based scanning to agentless scanning, back to agent scanning. And in the meantime, really all we got out of that was all these different prioritization frameworks, right? GPSs of the world, the CVSSs of the world. So that was kind of the journey that we've been on. And simultaneously what was happening is in the product security space, you had application scanning and shift left and all these things. And it started in the same place. It was, hey, we're deploying a bunch of code, we should probably try to secure some stuff, right? Then we were like, okay, well, maybe we can actually fix the root cause of some of these vulnerabilities. So rather than like generating and creating new millions of vulnerabilities, maybe we could stop vulnerabilities before they happen. Then we went from there and said, oh, turns out there's still a lot of vulnerabilities coming out. We're trying to shift left. And ASOC here was Application Security Orchestration and Correlation. Quite the mouthful. But basically it was, hey, we have a whole bunch of different types of scans that we have to do. Our technology stacks are increasing. And so it's a volume problem, but it's a horizontally changing volume problem versus in the traditional network security was much more a vertical scale problem. We have millions of kind of the same look and feeling type of things. Whereas on the application security side and product security side, it's a much wider breadth of things to fix, but not necessarily quite the same level of volume, but still equally as complex. And then we said, great, that's all well and good, but now we actually have to do all different types of scanning. I was told I have to do SAST and SCA and DAST and IAST and API scanning and like AI model scanning. It gets really complex really quick. And of course, the business is now saying, well, this is becoming a problem. We want visibility all over this. So that's where the ASPM kind of market started to come out around 2016, 2017. And then from there, we started to see all of these CSPMs start to take over and start to kind of broaden their offerings. And now we have this big platformization but these bigger, broader platforms kind of across the market. It can get really confusing. And this is where CTEM started to come into play. So Nucleus, we're a unified vulnerability management tool, but so we started to see this all go into one spot, where basically the idea is that these are all risks that the business wants to manage, and we need a better way to have a process kind of abstracted at a higher level where how do we actually feed a risk management program across all these different types of tools. And so this is where CTEM really comes into play, where obviously I think it was 2019, 2020, Gartner started to talk about CTEM, which is around how do we go from this point-in-time scanning and fixing and point-in-time and like this disjointed application security approach to a larger methodology that's a little bit more abstract so that we can actually encompass what a real risk management program should look like. And that's kind of where CTEM leaves us with today, right? And that's where a lot of this starts. But sounds pretty simple, right? High level, all these kinds of things. That's what I look like on a daily basis. I wish I looked like that on a daily basis, but that's a different problem. So it brings us to the question of like, what actually is CTEM? Like really, how do you use it? In order to use it, you have to understand what it is. So at a high level, you can think of it kind of like Zero Trust was for kind of on the defensive and the reactive side of security. We were really trying to come up with something that's more proactive, but is still a higher level methodology. So it's not about tools, and Chris is going to talk probably a lot about how it's not about the tools that you're using. It's about the higher level approach. And the big takeaway here is that you're probably already doing bits and pieces of it, and you just don't necessarily have a structured approach to doing it. So I don't know what you're seeing in the market, Chris, but this is where this is what we see as what it is, but it seems like a lot of folks are struggling with it.
Yeah, I mean, on that previous slide, you saw that over the years we tried a lot of different both technologies or processes or both, and we've struggled with those over those years. And so really, when Gartner developed CTEM as a best practice methodology, it was to help try to reboot find and fix security. Whether that's cloud security, application security, vulnerability management, it's, hey, we're just not reducing the risk we want to. We don't even really know how much risk these findings present to the business. So let's go about this a different way. And so yes, you may see technologies that have CTEM all over their websites, but it's really a strategy. It's not a single product. And we will dig into some of the tools that you own today that can help support a CTEM best practice approach. Any questions or thoughts on just what continuous threat exposure management is? Great.
Cool. So, I mean, they tried to keep it simple, right? All of these academic models try to do that. So they really boil it down to 5 distinct steps. And what's interesting about CTEM is that they use a lot of the same terminology that we used to use, 10 years ago when it came to vulnerability management, but they've broadened the scope. Is probably the big change, right? So if you compare it to the old school vulnerability management lifecycle here on the right? So it was really around typos. Anyway, discover all your stuff. You got to assess, basically. So the discover was like, hey, what is it that we want to scan for, right? Then it was how do we assess it? How do we prioritize it, report, remediate, and verify? Versus this kind of broader, higher level approach, right? So you'll notice even the language that is being used is much more around, so scoping, for example. We'll dive into each one of these and how you do it, but scoping is bigger than just discovery and assessment, right? It's kind of like a pre-step in the process, and what it really comes down to is that we're missing the thread that ties the whole process together, right? So it's very much like kind of, whack-a-mole in a lot of cases, and that's really the goal of what we're trying to address with CTEM. And there's a lot of different ways to go about each of these, but it's really not so much different than vulnerability management, but it's just blown up to a much bigger, grander scale.
I would say though, scoping is new, right? So
That's why it's a different color.
yeah, we didn't have. Is that why?
That's why.
Oh, I thought you ran out of.
I suck at colors, so.
Yeah, that is new, right? So our previous vulnerability management life cycles, our processes in the past didn't have an idea of scoping, and we'll dig into what scoping means, but that's new. Validation is also, I assume, red because it's new.
Yeah.
Because, again, we weren't really doing those two things. So some of these areas get combined in CTEM. Discover and assess are both discovery in CTEM. Prioritize is obviously a one-for-one.
Yeah.
Report and remediate are kind of combined in mobilization. So it is truly not just a new way of labeling a life cycle. It's truly a different life cycle.
Absolutely, and you see it's philosophically different too, and that's where a lot of these changes happen. And that leads us to actually how we get started, right? So this is like sort of the main crux of where we wanted to get to today, which is if you did nothing different, how would that map to CTEM? And I'm attributing that to some unknown analyst at Gartner probably. I wouldn't know, I don't talk to Gartner very often. But the first question is, really, how do you think about what scoping is? So this is, like, if you take nothing else away today, I would personally say this is probably the most important concept really to think about when it comes to what you're really trying to do in the change in approach, right? So historically, in vulnerability management, you start at the top, right? Oh, it's reflecting, that's cool. So it was very much your patch management was driven basically by what you can scan, right? So you start with a tool, you say, what can we discover? And then we're going to start patching based on that, right? It's basically very tool-centric. We've spent a lot of time and resources on discovery technologies, and then we've sort of equated that to what's important to the business. It's like, hey, let's generate a bunch of data and then figure out what's important to the business later. Whereas the big change is effectively what I call like pre-planning, right? So scoping is all about defining at a super high level what's actually important to the business and starting there, right? So scoping actually becomes more important than the scans and the technologies that you're using in this framework. So there's a bunch of examples, but it's about how do we align our processes to take care of what actually matters to our business. So you start from the business going into technology versus technology going into the business. And I don't know, I know you've done a lot of work in scopes, Chris, but am I hitting that in the area of the way? You probably have a better way to describe it than I do.
I wouldn't say a better way. I have a more
Perfect.
silly way.
Great.
So it's kind of like if we bought lunch for everyone and we said, okay, now we just have to figure out who has what for lunch. That's what we've been doing in vulnerability management. We have all this data, and then we figure out what are these assets, what do they do in our business, how bad are these findings, and it's like just piling in lunch and saying whose is what, whereas if we took in everyone's order and then ordered lunch, we would know as soon as it arrived automatically who it was. If we go looking for vulnerabilities or exposures related to a process in our business, we don't have this problem of, well, how do I attribute this data I found? I went looking for specific data, so I already know the attribution.
I have a very specific, tactical and operational example, right? So one issue that we run into a lot that we see in our customers is, hey, we have a whole bunch of data, we have all these scans, and we don't know who owns what, right? And then there are customers who come to us and say, hey, we actually are doing scan profile specifically where actually instead of one big scan, even across agents, we're actually saying that we're going to scan one specific subnet, and we know at the scope of the scan level that this whole entire scan belongs to this AWS account or this team. And it's really easy to classify what should happen because you don't really have to worry about ownership after the data has been discovered. You actually scanning becomes part of the remediation process rather than just kind of the beginning of the process. And that's sort of the piece here that is really important. It's about knowing and understanding what you're really trying to do. So obviously Gartner calls it kind of the scoping is the first step of the process. And this is the part that's really fun, right? Is that there's no real right way to define a scope. It's all about what's important to the business. So in the old days, we would have said something like, hey, you got to start with the threat model, right? So the threat model is and that sounds really big, and oftentimes it becomes a big exercise, but I think about it in terms of more like basic threat models, right? So even just asking the question, what would make me text the CISO in the middle of the night? We start with that, right? I just write all that down in a list. Guess what? That's probably where I want to start. I have my first scope. It can be that simple to get started, and then you say, okay, well, what scanning and discovery do I need to do? How do I make sure that that stuff gets fixed and patched? How do I build a process to remediate inside of that workflow? And congratulations, you have effectively started on your CTEM journey just by doing that. So it's starting with the threat model or starting with the scope is how you do it. And the most common ways that we see is generally around things like business units or critical applications, or even just, hey, we have compliance requirements, right? And it gets really interesting when you start to talk about, well, we actually have different scopes for different things. We have compliance scopes that has one set of processes, and then we actually have business criticality scopes over here. And then you can manage those differently, and it allows you to be a lot more precise in your processes. So it's like, how do you work on the process, not in the process?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, as close as you can get to a scope representing a function of your organization, the easier this will be, right? So, do we process payments, right? Maybe in the past, a lot of organizations already had at least one scope. If they were PCI governed, they went looking for their PCI, governed infrastructure. Oh, these are, the servers, the IP that do the payment processing. So what CTEM is asking us to do is, make the scope payment processing. That's a thing our business needs to do to make money. And so when we represent risk back, we can tell the business, hey, here are the exposures we have that might jeopardize us being able to process payments. An advantage of that is, well, we do have some regulatory obligations in our credit card processing, so we can treat that scope exactly how we need to for those obligations, rather than trying to treat everything in the business like it's PCI governed. So folks either struggled with that in the past, but if you had a good response to a regulatory obligation, it's a similar approach to scoping. Just think of it more as what is the function of our business. So if I'm a healthcare, or I may have had HIPAA, but really it's patient information is my scope, kind of thing.
Yeah, and a real world example even from just us at Nucleus, right? So we have a FedRAMP environment, and we also have just a regular kind of production environment. And so we have, at a high level, we have two scopes, two scope categories. Scope number one, everything that's US federal government, we have to treat that one way. Now, in that case, the government forces us to have a 15,000 page document that tells about how we do it. So I don't recommend that. But then on the other side, we have a different scope that's around production infrastructure. Like for us, the biggest risk to the business is us getting hacked, right? We're a relatively small business. We only have a few hundred customers, right? And so if and we have all the vulnerability data and exposure data for these customers. So if we got breached, that basically is our number one risk to the business. Scope number one, make sure that does not happen. So we can treat that differently than, hey, our workstations that, have some developer environments on there, right? So it gives you really good opportunities to be more precise in how you do things. Go for it.
Yeah, just before we move off scoping, because we want to highlight what you might already have today. So we went over, you might already have some compliance scopes, but realistically, a lot of our partner customers, when they're starting their scoping processes, when they're kind of getting their feet wet with this, they work with GRC folks. They work with either compliance folks or risk folks, because they may actually already have some sort of catalog of functions they're tracking. And the more we can use similar functions as other stakeholder groups, the less we have to kind of translate for the business. So sometimes that's business continuity or disaster recovery folks, sometimes that's GRC compliance folks, risk folks. So it's good to ask around, do we actually have a list of functions here? Because we might actually that work might be 80% done for us.
Yeah, I've seen it in HR systems and stuff too, right? It's been fun. I mean, we have to actually talk to people, guys. It sucks.
Or a product catalog. If you sell products or services, that's closer to what Gartner would want your scopes to be. So sometimes it's not even technology folks that can help us.
Oftentimes I would say it's probably not, right? Because a big part of this too is how do we get budget, how do we get resourcing, how do we get people to help with fixing things? And the best way to do that is we always hear about how do we translate this into the business, into the words of the business. Scoping is a really great way to do that. So you can actually use it outside of the CTEM process to actually get resources. So a little pro tip there. We've gotten a lot of extra money for security teams because of CTEM. However, the next step is discovery, because we are on a timeline. I could talk about scopes all day, but discovery is really where we have identified is kind of where a lot of the investment that most organizations are already doing today tends to be in this category, and then also prioritization as well. But discovery is where probably the most dollars per organization are spent. And the thing about CTEM, which is interesting, is that when I got started in cybersecurity, we had used the word vulnerability, and we're like, oh, that's a weakness, right? And so it was very broad, and everything to us was vulnerability management. And then, marketing happens, industries develop, and then vulnerability became synonymous with CVEs. And there's a whole lot of reasons for that, which would take me 30 minutes probably to explain. But what ended up happening is that CVE and the word vulnerability got co-opted into basically meaning a very specific type of weakness. And so the concept of an exposure is really a reset button on, hey, we can't use this word vulnerability anymore, in part because a Qualys or a Tenable uses the term vulnerability management, but they don't actually track all the different types of findings and exposures out there. And so this is meant to be the stake in the ground that says exposure management is really what you need to do. You need to manage all of it, right? So this is just a little graphic that, please don't judge me too hard, I made this on an airplane. But it's around the different types of findings that you will see in an organization, and all of them need to be managed within the context of CTEM, right? So part of the trick is figuring out which ones of these findings are more or less important in the context of the scope, right? So certain parts of your business applications, some might be very application heavy, some might not be. Some might literally be, hey, this is just, we have one workstation that is the most important thing, it's the CEO's device or whatever, and you don't actually have to worry about application security vulnerability. So all of this feeds into the one single normalized way of looking at risk.
Yeah, discovery, to a lot of us, we think of discovery like finding assets. Well, that's part of the discovery phase, but actually finding the misconfigurations, the vulnerabilities, the weaknesses in that technology is also part of discovery. It's all blended to one phase, and that's a little different. So we have our scope, we know what function of the business that we are looking to manage exposure on. Then we go looking for the technology that supports that scope, and then we look for the problems in that. That's all in this phase, and two very important parts. One, Scott's spot on. When we sit down with customers, the majority of their existing platforms fall into this, right? Your vulnerability agents, your scanners, your AppSec tools, your cloud security tools, all of that existing tool set we can use. We just have to understand it fits in this lifecycle stage. The other important thing is when you develop your scope, don't assume you have all the capabilities you need to discover the problems. A great example is often if our customers make an HR scope, they'll say, oh, 90% of what HR does is in Workday, and it's a SaaS platform. And maybe we don't have a discovery tool today to find weaknesses in Workday SaaS. That's okay. That's something you document in your program, and when we report the exposure of HR, we put a star next to it and say, hey, we're missing a capability on about 90% of that workload to find a problem. This is how we can actually start and not be afraid. We're not going to have everything we need, but what's important is to try to make known unknowns instead of unknown unknowns. We know what we're missing instead of just assuming we already have everything we need for discovery today.
Yeah, and this can get pretty complicated as well, especially how you measure the success of this phase. So one of the things that I always like to encourage folks is asking the question, because again, this is very driven by what's important to the business. And so, you have to think, well, what are the KPIs that help us understand on a per scope basis or just at a top level, how do we know we're doing a good job? And it's not just MTTR, SLAs, right? This focuses it on, it's also not just scan coverage, right? It could literally be, hey, we don't have tool coverage. It could be, it's about discovery coverage as much as it is about scan coverage, right? Because scan coverage is around the, hey, we're trying to get, an agent deployed on every single endpoint. That isn't necessarily the goal of CTEM, right? It's how do we get full coverage of all of the weaknesses inside of a subset of my assets or my infrastructure. And so that's kind of another key piece here is how do you measure it, right? It's in the back of my mind all the time. It's how do we measure it? Because otherwise, if you can't show success or explain it to the business, then it falls down oftentimes as well.
Mm-hmm. And part of this too, one example Gartner uses time and again is maybe leaked data. So on the dark web, some of our intellectual property or identities have been leaked. they recommend that be included in a CTEM program. And today, even if we have a capability in that, we often associate that more with like our SOC or a distinct function. So as we kind of try to, again, get more comfortable with CTEM, it's rethinking, well, what data makes up these blue, what are those?
Hexagons?
Hexagons.
Have you ever seen there's a YouTube video from like 10 years ago, it's the hexagons or the bestigons?
I
You
did
know that?
not see that one.
Anyway, sorry. It's the superior shape is what, basically that's the TLDR.
I was going to have a bad joke, and
I know.
so now I feel comturable saying it, because that was way worse.
It was way worse.
So you said you made this on an airplane. I said, I was going to say, I thought you made this on a computer.
Turns out actually we use Crayola crayons to make it.
But the long and short of it is we have to define what will be our exposure information, and it may be information we've never had before, or it may be things that we're using differently today, and that's okay.
Absolutely. Which gets us back into this same old age-old problem of we actually do have a lot of stuff we need to prioritize what to fix, right? And so, now we're moving from the kind of more like the very strategic high level, and then we're starting to move into, we're blending into the operational aspect of how we get going, but there's still a very strategic component to CTEM, which is one of the reasons we like it. It's that every phase has both an operational and a strategic component to it. And so prioritization, this is one of those things that there's probably tons and tons of opinions on, right? If you look at any of the vulnerability literature just over the last 20 years, there's been a very distinct kind of approach that we've just honed and gotten more precise over the years. And that is generally around like stack ranked types of findings, right? Because it's really easy to say, hey, we have a million things. What's the most critical thing to our business? I'm going to use the word critical, even though it's kind of not a great term for it. But what it generally breaks down to is 3 top-level ways of doing prioritization. There's no best way to do it. I would argue that the hybrid is probably the best way, but that's CTEM you have to use CTEM and strategy to unlock hybrid. You can't just go out and implement a hybrid prioritization model without doing anything. So most folks actually start with qualitative, right? Qualitative is what do I get, as just the output from these different tools, and that's your traditional critical high, mediums, and lows. Over the years, there's been more precise categorization of different types of findings, and that's where SSVC from CISA came out. And so SSVC it's still just a qualitative, categorical type of prioritization system. But what they've done is they've said there are actually a lot more factors that we can use that tie to actions in our business. So instead of saying, hey, something is critical, it's actually 48-hour remediation timeline. 72-hour remediation timeline, 1 week remediation timeline. So they don't tie it to your traditional kind of severity ratings. They tie it to what do you want to have happen in our business. So there's actually levels of maturity within each of these. And so there is no real magic right way to do it. One thing I would recommend is to not go all in on a quantitative score, because as you can see, a lot of things change over time. I think we're up to version 4 of CVSS, we're up to version 4 of EPSS, and they're going to launch more and more and more of those, and they're basically solving the same problem. We're just getting a little bit more efficient at identifying individual items that are more or less impressive or important. And then risk scores is something we hear a lot about, right? So if you hear things like Qualis's True Risk Score, Tenable's VPR score, every vendor under the sun has this. We at Nucleus have one of these, right? So risk scores is a common way of doing quantitative prioritization. It's probably the easy button. It's a little bit better than CVSS and EPSS, but hybrid is where you go and you say, how do we mix these together and tie it back to the scopes, right? So this scope requires qualitative because we can't measure, right? It's not CVE based, so we can't use our traditional CVE, CVSS scoring methodology. We need to come up with a different one. So maybe we actually need to do SSVC for this HR application, but then it's a purely patch management problem within our general workforce scope. We can just use a CVSS-based approach, right? They're not super critical. It's not super important to our business. So it's easier. Let's use an easier, little bit less efficient way of doing prioritization. So anyway, I went on for a long time on this one.
Well, that's because people go on a long time about this. So what we see in the real world are folks tend to spin their wheels on prioritization because we weren't seeing the risk reduction we wanted from our remediation owners. So we think if I could only prioritize these findings better, I'll somehow get better participation from operations or whoever has to fix this. But there's definitely a point of diminishing returns, whether you're traditional VM or whether you're CTEM. There's a point where you need to ask yourself, okay, is this good enough? Does this help me actually stack rank problems, or am I kind of getting in an eternal math problem? I've seen so many folks in my career, just they agonize over these numbers, and it's like, well, you already have a good indicator of how bad these problems are. You don't have to go crazy with the numbers. You need to focus elsewhere in the life cycle. That's what's holding you back. So the thing I encourage everyone to do when they're looking at prioritization, again, whether it's CTEM or your current practices, is to say, like, what am I trying to get out of prioritizing, and have I already achieved that? And there's some very practical parts of prioritization in CTEM that are helpful and probably we aren't doing today. One good example is, I like to call it collating problems. We say, oh, these 10 findings all have one parent cause.
Here we go.
Yeah. And doing that, do we have a capability? Like, some of our vulnerability tools have an option. We can turn on supersedence. Now that mainly works for patches. Oh, install the March patch. But that idea, does our cloud security tool have toxic combination calculation? Can we practically collate these? Instead of having to worry about the numbers, say, well, this is the real problem I'm going to hand off later, and let me just risk rank that. I already know how bad it is for my business because I went looking for problems in important business functions, so I know my scope. So I know the kind of criticality, the impact. And now let's get these to practical units before I apply my fun math.
Yep. And this is most common example of what we see as what I was talking about from a hybrid prioritization perspective. They'll say some findings, and we'll just use CVEs as the easy example here. Some CVEs are extremely high-level critical, right? We have to fix these as soon as possible. Those who move into an expedited single finding, stack rank, this finding is more important than this finding, which is more important than this finding. And that makes sense, right? You actually do want that, right? Like incident-led kind of vulnerability prioritization. But at the same time, you have a whole bunch of these mediums and lows that are just taken care of as part of our business process. So then the question becomes, for this group, how do we actually reduce the most risk at a high level? And a lot of times it's how do we get more coverage of the business processes we already have? And so it becomes really easy to say elevated priority versus non-elevated priority goes back into your grouping and your supersedence and those kinds of things. And so the trick is, how do you balance where that line is, right? And that's really the trick of prioritization inside of a CTEM program.
And that's the area where we see, if you're going to adopt a new capability, the first step is obviously, let's just kind of orient what we have today in a CTEM methodology. But if you need to adopt something, usually it's something in this prioritization. And the reason is, now that we're taking in data that we've never taken in before, we're now combining that AppSec, that cloud, the identity, even some of this leaked data on the dark web. Those findings don't always play nicely. A CVE and a CWE have a similar structure, but when I find that intellectual property on the dark web, it's not going to come in with a severity. It's not going to come in with any of those fields that I expect. So that's usually where we see the first thing you might want to adopt is a platform where I can at least put it all in one place and then come up with my own rules. Okay, when I see this, consider it a high because the data source doesn't give a severity.
There's not a ton of tools out there that actually do that. So that is one of the things in the market. There's like not a ton that have gone all in on this kind of approach. A lot of the vendors are saying, hey, let's lock you in. We're just going to launch a new capability to discover stuff on the dark web, which doesn't necessarily translate to the rest of your business processes, but that's a whole other conversation. We only have a few minutes left, so we're going to have to speed through this. But the other thing that I wanted to talk about real quick was this concept of validation, right? This is something that I want Chris to talk about here in a second, because he's seen this all over the place. Validation tends to be one of the ones that freaks people out a little bit when I talk to them about CTEM, because they're like, oh, does this mean we have to go implement some sort of breach and attack simulation tool? Does this mean we have to like go do attack path mapping and like figure out like all these super crazy, like it feels very advanced, right? But what I wanted to highlight here is that this is from the Wayback Machine from 2009. This is the marketing messaging from NetSparker from back in the day. And the very first thing I want you to look at is to say, oh, look, it's all about accuracy, right? How do you know that you minimize false positives? And really, when I talk about validation, there's levels to it. And the very first level is just, how do we minimize false positives when we deliver information to other teams? And there's a whole bunch of different ways, and there's like a whole bunch of different levels. I'll let you talk about the levels here, but validation doesn't have to mean we use crazy AI to like figure out patterns across our big data. It can literally just be as simple as, how do we triage false positives before we hand it off to remediation teams?
Yeah. Unfortunately, I do not think we solved dead accuracy a decade ago. We're still working
I
on
wish,
that.
man, I wish.
A part of the issue is find and fix security is prone to false negative and positive. And so really what Gartner's trying to inspire when they bring in a validation part of CTEM is to say, how believable is this data? If we hand off false positives, our mobilization partners are going to say this is junk data. And false negatives, the data we don't have, is very dangerous to us as well. And so the very first step isn't to go buy something that's going to automatically pen test or something like that. It's to say, hey, have we tuned our existing discovery tools? Things like, if I'm using scanning, what's my authentication rates? If I have agents, what's my agent health? And if I have multiple means of finding exposures in my technology, am I using the most effective one? You can start there. You don't have to actively validate these things. We can choose the most valid and most optimal of what we have.
And with that, we are out of time, so you can't see our beautiful, people tell us we don't use AI on our presentations. There's evidence that we do. And with that, the main takeaway, Chris and I were talking about this beforehand, write some shit down. That's our takeaway. That's really where a lot of this falls over.
You shouldn't quote me directly like that.
No.
Thanks, everybody.
Thanks, everybody.
Appreciate you.